We often mistake our pursuit of excellence for a ladder, when in reality it is a gilded cage of our own design. We imagine that if we can just reach the summit of flawlessness, we will finally be safe from judgment and the chaos of being human. But this pursuit is a slow suffocation, a paralyzing demand for a version of ourselves that does not breathe or bleed. It is the architecture of a monument, and monuments are only built for things that are no longer moving. This architecture of the soul requires a profound internal shift to dismantle, a journey we explore deeply here at the Elevated Within for those ready to face their own depths. We must begin by looking at the very nature of our desires and asking whether we are chasing the warmth of life or the cold stillness of an ideal. The answer lies in the distinction between the impulse to grow and the impulse to preserve a static, unyielding image. To understand why we are so often our own most brutal jailers, we must look at the psychological landscape of destructiveness. Erich Fromm, in his study of human nature, identified a fundamental split in the human psyche between what he called necrophilia and biophilia. Biophilia is the innate love of life, the drive toward growth, integration, and the unpredictable movement of living things. Necrophilia, in its psychological sense, is not an obsession with the deceased, but a love for the mechanical, the static, and the dead. It is the desire to turn that which is organic into something structured, predictable, and controllable. When we apply this lens to the modern obsession with perfection, a chilling realization emerges. Perfectionism is a necrophilous impulse. It is the subconscious wish to stop the clock, to fix the self into a permanent, unchangeable state of being that can no longer be touched by error. By seeking to be perfect, we are essentially seeking to be finished, and to be finished is to cease to exist as a living process. We treat our lives like marble statues rather than gardens, preferring the cold certainty of the stone over the messy, decaying, and regenerating soil. This necrophilous drive seeks to control life until it stops moving entirely. We become obsessed with order, logic, and the elimination of the unexpected, viewing every deviation from our plan as a threat to our sanity. In this state, we do not want to live life so much as we want to have lived it perfectly, looking back from a distance at a completed work. We trade the vibrant, pulsing uncertainty of the present moment for the sterile security of a checked box or a polished facade. This internal drive manifests as what Fromm termed malignant aggression, a form of destructiveness that serves no biological purpose. Unlike the healthy aggression required for self-defense, this is a predatory strike against our own spontaneity and progress. We attack our creative efforts and our personal growth because they aren't pure enough or because they carry the stench of human fallibility. We would rather kill the project, the dream, or the relationship entirely than allow it to exist in a messy, imperfect state. We choose the safety of a dead ideal over the terrifying risk of a messy life because the ideal cannot hurt us or disappoint us. The perfect version of you is a ghost that never fails, never stumbles, and never faces the embarrassment of being seen in the middle of a struggle. However, that ghost also never feels the sun on its face or the thrill of genuine connection. By worshipping the static image of who we should be, we effectively bury the person we actually are under layers of impossible expectations. This preference for the dead ideal is the ultimate form of self-alienation. We stand outside of our own experience, judging our performance rather than feeling our existence. Fromm suggests that the necrophilous person feels at home only with things that are mechanical and predictable, and so we try to turn our own psyche into a machine. We want to be a clock that never loses a second, forgetting that even the most perfect clock is merely a tool, while the person who holds it is a mystery. The first step toward liberation is the radical admission that the vessel of the self is already cracked and has been since the beginning. We must stop trying to protect a phantom that has never existed, the myth of the unbroken and pristine soul. The shadow of perfectionism only grows taller when we refuse to acknowledge the fractures that make us real. Until we stop chasing the ghost of the unbroken, we will remain trapped in the cold, silent holes of our own making, waiting for a life that is too afraid to start. The moment of impact is rarely as loud as we fear, but its silence is devastating. It is the weight of a missed deadline, the cold realization of a failed relationship, or the stinging shame of a public mistake that finally pierces the armor of our idealism. For the perfectionist, this is not merely an error in judgment or a stroke of bad luck. It is a fundamental collapse of the self. We have built our identity on the premise of being a seamless, unbroken surface, and when that surface finally gives way, we feel as though we have been erased. We look at the shards of our efforts and see only waste, a collection of jagged edges that testify to our inadequacy. Our cultural reflex is to sweep these pieces away as quickly as possible. We live in a society that fetishizes the new, the pristine, and the untouched, viewing any sign of wear or repair as a decrease in value. When something breaks, we discard it, and when we break, we attempt to hide the damage under layers of performance or withdrawal. We are taught that the only way to be worthy is to remain intact, leading us to view our personal history as a series of failures to be forgotten rather than a journey to be understood. This drive to erase the evidence of our struggle is the final victory of the necrophilous impulse, preferring a sterile void over a scarred reality. Yet there is an ancient alternative that suggests the break is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a more profound one. In 15th century Japan, the aesthetic philosophy of Wabi-sabi emerged to challenge the obsession with permanence and perfection. It teaches us to find a quiet, resonant beauty in the transient, the weathered, and the imperfect. This worldview birthed the art of Kintsugi, or golden joinery, which began when a shogun sent a damaged tea bowl to China for repairs, and was horrified by the ugly metal staples used to hold it together. He sought a more graceful solution, leading Japanese craftsmen to develop a method of mending pottery with a specialized lacquer mixed with powdered gold. In the practice of kintsugi, the artisan does not try to disguise the fracture or return the object to its original state. Instead, the cracks are traced with luminous gold, making the history of the break the most visible and valuable part of the piece. The bowl is no longer just a vessel. It is a narrative of resilience, an object that has endured the chaos of the world and emerged transformed. The scar is not a mark of shame, but a badge of survival, a shimmering map of the moments where the object met the forces of life and refused to be destroyed. By highlighting the damage, the artist honors the specific journey of that individual object, elevating its unique flaws above the generic beauty of the mass-produced. This shift in perspective allows us to view our own failures through what Erich Fromm would call a biophilic lens. If biophilia is the love of life and all that is alive, then we must recognize that life, by its very nature, involves collision, friction, and eventual breakage. A stone does not break in the way, a heart does because the stone is not participating in the vibrant, risky process of growth. When we experience the shattering of our expectations, it is evidence that we have stepped out of the sterile safety of the necrophilous ideal and into the arena of the living. Our mistakes are not signs of deadness or worthlessness. They are the fingerprints of a soul that is actually engaging with the world. To be unbroken is to be untested, a hollow shell that has never carried anything of weight. When we stop viewing our psychological wounds as defects, we begin to see them as the very places where the light of consciousness can finally enter. Fromm argued that the human condition is defined by the tension between our biological limitations and our infinite potential, a tension that inevitably leads to moments of internal rupture. These ruptures are not the death of the self, but the birth of a more complex, integrated version of who we are. They are the sites where the old, rigid structures of the ego have failed, making room for something more flexible and enduring to take root. We must learn to sit with the shards of our shattered plans without the immediate urge to throw them away in disgust. The history of the break is the history of a life being lived out loud, rather than a life being hidden in the shadows of a perfect facade. By accepting the fracture, we move away from the necrophilous desire for a finished, static identity and toward the biophilic embrace of a continuous, evolving process. We are not fragile things that must be kept in a glass case. We are living works of art that are meant to be handled, used, and inevitably mended. The gold is waiting for the lacquer, but first, we must be willing to look at the pieces and realize that nothing truly valuable is ever entirely seamless. The act of mending begins when we start mourning the loss of the original form and start engaging with the reality of what remains. This is what Erich Fromm called the productive orientation, a state of being where we no longer view ourselves as passive victims of our circumstances, but as active creators of our meaning. In the vacuum left by the collapse of perfectionism, we find the raw materials for a different kind of power. We are moving from a reactive mode, where we simply try to survive our mistakes, into a generative mode, where the mistake itself becomes the catalyst for a deeper integrity. This is the alchemy of the soul, where the base metal of our suffering is transmuted into the gold of understanding. In the Kintsugi process, the gold is not just a filler, it is a declaration of presence. In psychological terms, this gold is our consciousness, the deliberate, shining awareness we bring to the parts of ourselves we once tried to hide. When we apply this gold to our cracks, we are making a choice to see our history with clarity rather than shame. We are no longer trying to pretend the injury didn't happen, but rather, we are using the injury as a focal point for our most intense attention. This consciousness is the only force capable of binding the disparate pieces of a shattered ego back into a coherent whole. Fromm understood that the cure for destructiveness is not mere relaxation or the absence of conflict, but the engagement in productive love and work. Kintsugi is a slow, methodical discipline that mirrors this psychological reality, requiring a patience that the perfectionist critic cannot tolerate. The critic demands an instant restoration, a magic wand that erases the evidence of the struggle, but the artist knows that the bond only holds if the lacquer is allowed to cure in its own time. We must learn to love the process of our own repair more than we love the fantasy of being finished. This labor is not a chore to be completed, but a lifestyle of constant, attentive care for the vessel we inhabit. As we trace the lines of our fractures with this golden consciousness, we are performing the essential work of shadow integration. We are not returning to an original, pristine state of innocence, but are instead moving toward a third state of being that encompasses both the break and the mending. This is the reinforced self, a psychological structure that is no longer threatened by its own darkness, because it has already survived the encounter. We stop seeing our shadow as a separate, terrifying entity and begin to see it as the necessary boundary where our strength was tested and found. The resulting self is more complex and more honest than the one that existed before the shattering. There is a profound structural truth in Kintsugi that serves as a radical promise for the human psyche. The gold-bonded cracks are often stronger than the original clay. When we integrate our failures through the productive orientation, the points of our greatest vulnerability become the foundations of our greatest resilience. We do not just become whole again, we become reinforced, possessing a tempered durability that the unblemished can never know. A person who is never broken is fragile because they do not know how they will react to the weight of the world. A person who has been mended carries the proof of their own endurance within the very fabric of their character. This transformation requires us to abandon the necrophilous obsession with having a perfect image and embrace the biophilic necessity of being a resilient person. The perfectionist is haunted by the fear of losing their status, their looks, or their reputation, things they have rather than things they are. When we shift into the orientation of being, we realize that our value is not located in the smoothness of our surface, but in our capacity to respond to life with creativity and courage. We stop trying to possess a life that looks good from the outside and start living a life that feels authentic from the inside. The mended vessel does not ask to be admired for its lack of flaws, but for the wisdom of its repairs. The gold in the lacquer represents the transition from a life governed by the fear of death to a life fueled by the love of growth. By choosing to highlight our scars, we are making a radical commitment to the present moment and all the messiness it entails. We are no longer waiting for a future where we are finally fixed, but are instead finding the beauty in the ongoing act of becoming. This is the ultimate defeat of the perfectionist shadow, for it cannot survive in an environment where mistakes are treated as opportunities for artistry. We are moving into a space where every break is an invitation to add more gold, ensuring that our story is one of continuous, luminous evolution. The shift from the necrophilous urge to destroy our flaws to the biophilic urge to integrate them marks the birth of the anatomy of creativity. This is not a passive acceptance of failure, but an active, artistic engagement with the reality of our existence. Instead of viewing a mistake as a reason to discard the self, we view it as the raw material for a new, more resilient structure. We move from being the judge who condemns to being the craftsman who creates, understanding that our power lies in our ability to synthesize the broken parts of our history. In the theater of daily life, this transformation manifests as a change in our internal dialogue the moment things go wrong. When the vase of our expectations shatters, the perfectionist critic immediately reaches for the hammer to finish the job, but the Kintsugi artist reaches for the gold. This gold is the practice of self-compassion, a deliberate infusion of warmth into the jagged edges of our disappointment. We stop asking why we were so clumsy and start asking how we can weave this new reality into the tapestry of our character. Applying this gold requires a radical presence that refuses to look away from the damage. It is a slow, methodical process of acknowledging the pain without letting it define the entirety of our worth. By treating our errors with the same reverence a master craftsman treats a broken relic, we signal to our subconscious that we are worthy of care even when we are not whole. This daily ritual of mending ensures that we are constantly growing stronger at the seams, rather than remaining brittle and fearful of the next inevitable impact. As we become more adept at mending ourselves, we naturally begin to live with a transparency that is inherently biophilic. Showing our gold-filled cracks to the world is an act of rebellion against the sterile, plastic standards of a society obsessed with the unbroken. When we stop hiding our struggles, we provide a silent permission for everyone around us to set down their own masks of perfection. Our vulnerability becomes a beacon of life, proving that it is possible to be both damaged and magnificent at the same time. This outward expression of our repairs is the ultimate antidote to the isolation of the perfectionist. By inviting others to see the gold in our fractures, we create a community of the mended rather than a competition of the pristine. We realize that the most profound connections are formed not through our shared successes, but through the recognition of each other's resilience. This is the biophilic life in action, a continuous celebration of the messy, unpredictable, and beautiful process of staying alive and staying open. Erich Fromm's vision of the fully human person is someone who has transcended the need for static security and embraced the dynamic flow of life. This individual understands that being human is not a destination to be reached, but a process of constant breaking and rebuilding. Kintsugi serves as the visual confirmation of this philosophy, showing us that the most beautiful souls are those that have been through the fire and chosen to stay together. We find our ultimate purpose not in avoiding the break, but in the quality of the repair we offer to ourselves and the world. The shadow of perfectionism is ultimately an illusion cast by a light you haven't yet learned to harness for your own healing. It is a sign that you are standing in front of your own brilliance, afraid to let the rays touch the parts of you that feel unfinished. You are not a failure for having fallen. You are a masterpiece in the making, and the gold is already in your hands. If you are ready to stop hiding and start mending, join us on this journey by subscribing to the Elevated Within as we turn our fractures into our greatest strengths.